Drawing with ink can be rather difficult, especially if you don't have a lot of practice and a lot of experience doing it. For a lot of people who are just starting, it feels like it's so permanent that mistakes, should they arise, will exist through to the end of the process. And for anyone, this can be a rather difficult notion. However, there exists a very simple process that can allow you to escape many of these potential errors. And that's starting with an undersketch, starting with a drawing beneath your drawing, as it were. For some, this will seem painfully obvious, yet for others, it will feel almost like cheating. And so today, in this particular ink drawing lesson, I want to talk about the importance of starting an undersketch, especially if you're working with something that you're not used to, a new topic, something experimental, or especially if you're working on something from imagination. I'm going to be drawing a robot today. I have no particular plan. I'm just going to start with some basic shapes and see where things take me. You've been watching the first part of this process play out as I began the introduction. These are my basic shapes, and after I finished them, I simply began to go in and refine some of the details. That's actually exactly what I'm doing right now. I got in the basic shapes, where the arms are going to be, the legs, there's going to be a central eye, and now I'm going around adding some additional shapes and starting to work on some of how these things are going to integrate with one another. Often, this is exactly how I start my drawings. Basic shapes underneath, some semblance of an idea sometimes, and sometimes not. This is one of those nots. I had no plan, I did no pre-sketching. I was hoping desperately that it would work out, that it would turn into something interesting. But even if it didn't, that would still probably be a decent lesson, especially if you watch drawings like this and go, I could never do that. Sometimes the failures are just as productive. So I'm going to take a couple minutes here and I'm going to work on refining these details. Mostly this is making it interesting to me, working out how the pieces integrate with one another. If you find that with something like a robot you struggle with how these pieces integrate with one another, you don't need to overthink it. I didn't put joints, for example, on the arms. I didn't think about how the legs would actually move here. There are drawings where I do that, but for this case, I just wanted to get something that would look a little bit interesting. Satisfied, at least for the moment, with my sketch, I'm starting to take in ink. You'll notice that this doesn't follow a particularly linear path right at the beginning. This is another thing that I think is kind of important to share with you. This is something that's happening because the idea hasn't been totally fleshed out in my mind. And so what I'm starting to do is simply follow most of the main lines that I know will function, that won't need to be modified later, that I'm confident in. And I'm just going around and filling in those shapes. I'm leaving gaps where I'm not 100% sure that I have the precise fine motor skill to make that line in one go, and I'm also giving myself the ability to modify the texture on those surfaces later. Sometimes I will add in bumps or scrapes or things like that, and so I find that not completing the entire silhouette of a thing actually allows me to make those decisions later, and therefore I have less pressure in the moment and more fun with the actual drawing process. This is the first stage of how I ink something, especially a drawing like this where I'm working heavily off of the undersketch and trying to just play. I'm allowing those loose lines from the sketch underneath to inform the decisions that I make. And that's one of the most beneficial things of actually sketching underneath your ink drawings, is that it allows you to try out things that you might be scared to try out under normal circumstances. Again, for some people, it might seem silly to be scared of making a particular kind of drawing, but as artists, we don't like things to mess up usually. And so it can be scary to try something new. I find that sketching is one of the most beneficial things you can do here to avoid that fear, or at least curtail it to some degree. That's what I've done here. By sketching out those lines, I've taken away some of the fear. I've taken away some of the possibility for mistakes. I've given myself training wheels, essentially. I have things to follow. And indeed, not completing all of the outlining at this stage is another crutch that I have given myself, something to make the process less intimidating and more enjoyable. I'm going to continue to move around this drawing before I move on to the next stage of inking. And I am going to speed this up for your convenience. Now I'm going to start going through and patching up some of those holes that were still left in the silhouette of the line art. I'm also going to start adding just some smaller details. I haven't thought about these ahead of time, just like the rest of the drawing, but I find that sometimes these pseudo-random details can make things feel a little bit more lifelike. This is a pretty relaxed step. The hard work, the stressful work, as it were, is generally those earlier stages. The sketch, sometimes, though not often for me, but generally that first layer of ink. That's where the mistakes can really be made. At this stage, for at least a while, I'm kind of just gliding, and it feels low pressure. It's quite nice to just shove on a podcast or a YouTube video or some music in the background and just proceed with the drawing. For me, this is where most of the joy in my artwork comes, these middle stages where most of the groundwork has been laid and I'm not having to worry about the tiny little intricate details that I'll do as finishing details at the end. So revel in this. If you find the beginning or the end of your drawings more stressful, then I would encourage you to do whatever is necessary to get to that middle stage so that you, like me, can enjoy it more thoroughly. I'm going to keep going around this and just filling in some details, fixing some of those gaps on the side, and I'm going to speed this up again before we come back and start working on some of the texturing details. This step is primarily focused on giving surface texture and three-dimensionality to whatever it is I've drawn. In this case, a robot. So we're going to be looking at how do we differentiate the different kinds of materials, primarily metals, but also how do we infer where the light source is, how the light is moving around the object. I'm going to start with just some rough hatching and cross-hatching here at the bottom of the central opaloid structure. And then I'm going to go to other pieces, especially on the arms, and make sure I've got some lines there to kind of tell which direction they're moving. This stage requires a little bit more thought. I'm not necessarily leaning as heavily on the undersketch anymore, but it has paved the way for all of this. The sketch really is what allowed us to achieve any of what's going on here, because without it, I wouldn't necessarily have the whimsy, the confidence to move through the project in this particular way. The sketching process really does only comprise about 10% of the time you put into a drawing quite often, but it lays the groundwork for everything that you accomplish. Some of those random lines that you make because you just aren't caring about the effects they might have later on can actually lay the groundwork for these wonderful and whimsical movements. And I find that that's a really enjoyable thing to do. You will find probably that every once in a while those choices will not turn out in your favor, but I find that 9 times out of 10 they turn out all right, and that probably 20%, 30% of the time they get me in a place where I do something I would never make as a traditional decision. And that's probably the largest reason to do this. I find that when I allow myself that undersketch or some reference work or sketching ahead of time, that I will come up with more intriguing things, and they're generally bolstered by better detail in that way. As I start to move down the legs, I'm doing pretty similar things, just trying to infer some texture and trying to understand how these objects are wrapping and rotating. The little guy is developing some character here. I'm not exactly sure what he's up to. I didn't put that much thought into it. Of course, he has some kind of exhaust port on the top because I always like to torture myself by forcing myself to do clouds and smoke and things like that. Something I find rather challenging. Something I've actually spent quite a bit of time working on in my ink journeys. Why I subject myself to the things that are more difficult, I couldn't guess. I would like to suggest that it's because I am so rigorously working on developing the skills in the areas that I am still lacking, but it's mostly I just stumble into things. Sometimes that's okay, but it can also be a wise and perhaps wiser thing to push yourself in the directions where you need to be challenged. But I'm enjoying the fact that this robot, this goofy little guy with so little forethought, actually feels like he has some personality to him. I'm now trying to kind of finish off some textural components to make it feel like it's not a pristine piece of metal. This is something in the early years of my ink drawing I basically never did. And nowadays I do it. In fact, what it is it's mimicking the old school way of working with ink with a dip pen, where inevitably you would make mistakes. Your ink would run out mid-stroke, and so you'd get a thinner line or a thicker line. Sometimes you get a blot on there. I find that those kinds of details have more soul to them. They're more intriguing. And so nowadays, I will often take a quick pass at the end like you're watching here, and I will add some artificial textures, almost like the ink splattered at some point. You can overdo this for sure, but a little bit of it added up over time in layers and then stopping and taking a look at your piece can actually give it a really intriguing ink texture. Now I'm going to start adding in a shadow, and after I do so, I take another quick look at the cloud of smoke up above and decide that I'm unsatisfied with it, so I'm going to go add some darker shapes and shades in there as well. It's pretty key and important, especially when you work from a loose undersketch like this drawing did, to take some breaks here and then, take a peek at what you've done, just like I mentioned with the texture a moment ago, and see where you need to modify things. There is zero shame and should be no embarrassment in having to revisit another portion of your drawing to make sure that it achieves whatever you were seeking to achieve with that drawing. If you can find a way to modify something slightly that you did earlier in the piece and achieve a higher level of satisfaction, you should always seek that out. You don't need to put any artificial expectations on yourself and feel like you should have hit that mark correctly the first time you did that thing. That's kind of silly, and if you feel like you're putting any of that pressure on yourself, I would encourage you just to release it. It's always good to take a break and come back to the drawing. Sometimes that break is a couple moments, sometimes it can be a couple hours. You can go get lunch or go run some errands and come back, look at your drawing, and see what you think needs to be modified. Well, that has been my quick video on an undersketch, the power of it, what it can do for you, how it can encourage you to try new things. I hope this has been beneficial for you, and I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comments below. Particularly, I would love to hear what you would like to see next as we continue to move forward on more ink techniques. In not that many months, we're going to be hitting Smogist, and after that, we're going to be hitting Inktober again, and I will have a lot of content coming your way during that time period. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out the Patreon or the Discord, they are both linked below. And again, thank you for your time. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.